Anyway, I've chosen a very dramatic slide to start off because for me it is actually a great pleasure to actually be up here speaking in Berlin. And I'm not saying that just because that's what speakers say. It's because I did once set off back in 2001 to speak here before at this conference, and I never actually arrived. And if you want to know the story of what happened, you'll have to look it up in my blog and you'll find all about it. That's to try and get a few hundred people onto my blog, which is a good tactic. Anyway, when this conference was designed, if that's the right word, several months ago, there's no doubt that the issue of how we deal with Gen Y was probably one of the most topical and major issues that we're facing people in education and training. I think that the organisers would have to acknowledge that things have really sort of jumped past them, and another issue has become even more dominant and even more compelling than the one of Gen Y. I'm not even going to tell you what it is, because I think if you don't know what it is, then you're probably not qualified to be here today, which is that'll get you thinking what it might. But I'm going to try and cover that. I'm looking very much from the perspective of workplace learning and development, because that's all I know about. Now, I gather that quite a few of you are in that sector. Can I have the hands up? Who's responsible in some way for learning and development in the workplace? Could you put your hand up, please? Okay, it is a fair number of people. Good. Well, this presentation is primarily for you, but so that's fine. But for the rest of you, I've got to give something in it for you. So how many people here have a job? Yeah. Well, how many of you will still have a job on Monday? That's the question. That's what you hope. You hope. Well, okay. Those of you who have a job, you are, if you like, consumers of workplace learning. So you are stakeholders in this process and participants. So I think in that case, you'll still have an interest in the subject. And what I'd like to do is to explore with you the extent that change has or has not taken place in workplace learning, and the extent to which it must take place in the near future. And that's the argument I'm going to try and put across to you. First of all, I'm going to share with you a great picture. Now, I don't know how many of you... Who is this, by the way? Anybody know? Who could it put? You can tell that this was a few years ago. In fact, it says 100,000 years ago. If you can work out why I've said that, then again, maybe there has to be some prize for you. I will tell you at the end. Anyway, you can see it was quite a long time ago because of the flares, though, of course, they've come round back again. There's the British Telecom plastic trim phone, the vinyl record deck, the valve-operated television. What else have we got here? A reel-to-reel tape recorder. All my best music was on reel-to-reel, and of course now you can't play it. Anyway, they say actually the best way you can tell the different generations is by how they store their music. So if you're on reel-to-reel, I don't know what that tells you. I was supposing that there was something after it's what happens to baby boomers when they retire. I was thinking about this afternoon, is that they become Generation Z, which is not too far off from me. Generation Z is when the main characteristic is you're primarily asleep. You see, it's a zzz, and that's a homemade joke. It must be credited to me if you use that one in future. So Gen Z, and I have one. What happens after Gen Z? Do we go back to the beginning and start again at Gen A? Well, that's one of those things that we'll have to think about later. Anyway, you might have expected a lot of things to have changed in the last 100,000 years. Have they? I don't know. First of all, learning methods, I'm beginning to believe, are relatively timeless. If you were to look at... I've just put a selection of learning methods up here. If you were to go back 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, most of the methods, you could say the pedagogies if you like, are pretty timeless. Only a few of those have actually been dependent on the invention of media. Obvious examples like reading and being able to listen to recorded music or recorded audio or recorded video. But most methods are timeless. But the choices that we make amongst them do change. So the emphasis can shift. So here I've done a sort of my own view of what are the sort of methods which are more dominant or less dominant in workplace learning at the moment. And you can see there's a heavy predominance of instruction, and perhaps the equivalent in the universities might be lectures. And we might think that this mix of methods might change over time. Even though the range doesn't change, the selections we make might change. And there are some pretty compelling reasons for taking another look at which of the methods we do actually select. And I'm going to look at three particular forces for change. One is new thinking, the next is new expectations, and the third is new pressures. I want to start with the issue of new thinking. Now, you've probably heard of connectivism. I always think it's quite funny. We had cognitivism, we had constructivism, now we've got connectivism. I think whoever comes up with a new grand theory of learning, can they start with a new letter of the alphabet, please? That's an absolutely... because it's almost impossible to say these words now. But I particularly think connectivism is a new theory of our times and stems primarily from some of our colleagues in Canada, like George Siemens and others. And I think that connectivism I like because connectivism is all about connections, and it's about connections at the micro level in terms of the way that we learn by making connections between neurons. But it's more importantly about the fact that we learn in 2008 by making connections externally, not necessarily just inside the brain, but we have the outboard brain as well. And that the implication for this in the workplace is quite profound because it means that instead of trying to, if you like, to try and help people to construct knowledge which they store permanently within their brains, we're much more realistically going to be looking at providing them with a network or the access to a network or ways of building a network which will allow them to access resources, whether those are human or materials, which will enable them to support them in doing their jobs. And that is a profound difference, I think, in the way we do workplace learning at the moment. Now, this is what George Siemens said about connectivism, and I think I'm just going to leave you to read that, because one of the golden rules is never to read out what's on the screen, so I'm going to let you do that. But I think you'll realize that this is much more typical of the way that people want to learn at work in 2008. Now, another one of the changes in thinking, which I think reflects on the way we select methods, is in terms of the findings from neuroscience. Now, a lot of these might be considered still contentious. Can they be applied in terms of pedagogical values or not? But there's no doubt that at a micro level, in terms of the design of content, the design of experiences, we're now much more aware of the danger of overloading learners. We're much more aware of the way that we should mix media in order to efficiently encourage the learning process. We're much more aware of the difficulty with which learners that learners face in integrating new knowledge and skills into long-term memory, and the problems they have with retrieving that knowledge and those skills. And because of that, we probably now know pretty well for sure that we shouldn't be talking at people for hours on end or asking them to, read large volumes of material or to undergo 30-hour e-learning programs. And there are plenty of organizations who inflict 30-hour e-learning programs on their organizations. The only ones that benefit are the producers who get a fat fee for doing that. Now, I think one of the benefits of neuroscience and new thinking is that we can begin to start putting some of the pop psychology which we inflict on so many of our learning development professionals into the dustbin. So I'm going to ask for some votes here. How many people would be happy to see neuro-linguistic programming go in the bin? If you feel that, thumbs up. Thumbs up if you want to support it. Thumbs down if it goes in the bin. All right? Okay. Well, it's going in the bin, whether you like it or not. How about learning styles? Can we put that in the bin? Yeah, that's going down in the bin too. And I must admit, I think Maslow's hierarchy of needs has to go too, because I did read the book that Maslow wrote, and I did really enjoy it. And he seems like a very nice bloke, which seems a bit unfair, but I still think it's got to go in the bin. Because we are trying, I think, to be a bit more rational about the way that we choose the learning theories. And I wish some of these would now be taught to our trainers and our teachers